violence is spreading across the country. Over 100 U.S. cities are seeing protests and civil unrest.
In the middle of the night in suburban Chicago, the chants and signs of what started as a quiet protest outside the Broadview ICE Processing Center quickly turned into chaos. Within minutes, barricades were torn down, smoke billowed, and federal officers were forced to guard the gates. Tires burned on the pavement as sparks from homemade incendiaries lit up the night sky. Calls for backup from local police went unanswered. By dawn, the facility was surrounded, several officers were injured, and the Department of Homeland Security had no choice but to declare a full-blown emergency. What happened next would reveal a deeper pattern, one that stretched far beyond Illinois and hinted at a growing national security threat within the United States itself. Stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe to Military Power to uncover the hidden wars shaping America's homeland. At approximately 3:47 in the morning, the situation at the Broadview ICE Processing Center reached a critical point. Dozens of federal officers were pinned down as the crowd pressed closer to the compound's main entrance. Communication channels were overloaded, and the chain of command realized that standard crowd control tactics had failed. With local police units refusing to respond, the Department of Homeland Security made a rare and decisive move. The order was given to deploy armored tactical units. Within minutes, convoys of DHS armored vehicles rolled out from a federal staging area in Joliet, heading north toward Chicago. Their arrival marked one of the most significant domestic deployments of federal armor in recent memory. When the first vehicles arrived, the night was still filled with smoke and the echo of flash grenades. The armored units took defensive positions around the perimeter, using floodlights to push back the crowd and create a secure zone for medical evacuation. Federal officers regrouped inside the facility, while tactical teams advanced methodically, clearing each access road and nearby alley. By 4:10 a.m., the crowd's momentum had collapsed. Dozens of suspects were restrained on the ground as riot shields and tear gas finally brought the situation under control. For the officers trapped inside, the sight of armored convoys was more than relief. It was proof that Washington had taken command of a battle unfolding inside its own borders. The early morning operation lasted less than 40 minutes, but left a deep impression. By sunrise, over 60 people had been detained for unlawful assembly, property destruction, or assaulting federal agents. Several officers were hospitalized with burns and head injuries, though none were in critical condition. The damage to the Broadview facility was severe. Vehicles were destroyed, gates were twisted out of shape, and several parts of the building were scorched. Investigators spent the following hours collecting evidence and identifying those responsible for the coordinated attack. The decision to deploy armored units inside the continental United States reignited a heated national debate. To many Americans, the image of federal armored vehicles moving through suburban Chicago seemed uncomfortably close to scenes from foreign conflict zones. Critics questioned whether the government's use of force had crossed a line. Others argued that the DHS had no alternative after local law enforcement refused to respond. In Washington, senior officials defended the action as necessary to preserve order and protect federal personnel. They emphasized that the units had operated under strict engagement rules and had withdrawn as soon as the threat was neutralized. Within hours, footage of the deployment spread across social media. Videos showing armored vehicles arriving at the facility were viewed millions of times. Some commentators described it as a warning of rising unrest inside the country, while others saw it as evidence that the federal government was still capable of decisive action. When local systems failed, news outlets replayed aerial footage of the scene at dawn, showing the burned cars and the armored vehicles parked in silence under the pale morning light. The images created a symbol of what many began calling America's new front line, where federal law enforcement confronted the growing wave of organized extremism. By mid-morning, the Broadview facility was under full federal control. Cleanup teams worked alongside investigators to document the extent of the damage. The armored vehicles remained stationed nearby for most of the day as a deterrent against renewed violence. While traffic resumed and residents began their routines, the marks of the confrontation were still visible. The blackened pavement, broken barriers, and scattered debris were silent reminders of how quickly disorder had escalated into a federal emergency. In the months following the Broadview incident, a disturbing pattern began to emerge across the United States. Between January and June, attacks on personnel from Immigration and Customs Enforcement and the Department of Homeland Security rose by more than 700% compared to the same period the previous year. The numbers were not limited to minor acts of resistance or vandalism. They represented coordinated violence, targeting federal agents and facilities from coast to coast. The escalation was so fast that intelligence analysts began treating it as a new phase of domestic extremism rather than isolated criminal acts. The incidents shared similar characteristics. Each began as a local disturbance or protest before shifting into sudden and organized violence. In California, a hotel used to house ICE and Customs and Border Protection officers became the target of a Molotov cocktail attack. The explosion injured civilians and forced the temporary evacuation of nearby buildings. In Minnesota, an officer was dragged nearly 50 yards by a fleeing suspect after an attempted arrest. In Nebraska, a Venezuelan national believed to be linked to the Tren de Aragua criminal network assaulted a federal agent during a transport operation. Each event underscored how widespread and unpredictable the threat had become. Federal agents were no longer confronting scattered resistance. They were facing groups with coordination, planning, and intent. In Texas, the situation turned even more violent. In Dallas, a gunman opened fire from a rooftop at ICE transport vehicles, killing 2 detainees and injuring several others before taking his own life. Days later, in the border city of McAllen, an armed individual exchanged gunfire with federal officers outside a Border Patrol facility. Both incidents were later connected through online activity and shared communication methods, indicating they were not random attacks. Investigators concluded that the suspects had used encrypted applications to coordinate logistics and identify weak points in federal operations. The discovery marked a turning point in how agencies viewed the threat. It confirmed that these were not spontaneous outbursts, but part of a wider network operating inside the country. Federal intelligence divisions began to map what they called interconnected threat zones. Data analysis revealed clusters of incidents along key transport corridors linking Chicago, Dallas, and Los Angeles. These locations matched regions with the highest concentration of immigration enforcement activity. By mid-year, DHS fusion centers and the FBI's counterterrorism unit had logged dozens of incidents that followed a nearly identical pattern: initial protests, a sudden surge in violence, and digital traces linking perpetrators across state lines. Analysts started referring to this pattern as a multi-state extremist chain, a decentralized structure that borrowed tactics from both ideological movements and organized crime. The government response grew more urgent as new evidence came in. Federal law enforcement expanded surveillance of online platforms where planning appeared to take place. Encrypted chat rooms, closed social media groups, and anonymous servers became the new battleground. DHS analysts noticed that many messages shared by these groups promoted the same narratives of resistance and hostility toward immigration enforcement. The coordination between domestic extremists and transnational gangs added a dangerous new dimension. The line separating ideology from organized crime became increasingly blurred, making traditional counter-extremism measures less effective. By early summer, the impact was visible on every level of federal operations. ICE field offices increased security protocols and reduced public visibility. Agents were instructed to vary their routes and work schedules to avoid surveillance. DHS vehicles were reinforced with additional armor and new tracking systems. Training programs were updated to include scenarios involving armed ambushes and coordinated assaults. These adjustments reflected the reality that domestic threats were now operating with the sophistication once seen only in international terrorism cases. By the end of June, the scale of the threat was undeniable. Over 100 separate incidents involving federal immigration personnel had been reported nationwide. The coordinated nature of these attacks forced DHS and the FBI to redefine their threat assessment models. What had once been treated as sporadic unrest was now categorized as an organized campaign targeting the infrastructure of federal authority. The question confronting policymakers was no longer whether the violence would continue, but where it would strike next. This growing wave of attacks set the stage for a national reckoning. It revealed how domestic extremism had evolved beyond ideology and into strategy. The next phase of the government's response would determine whether the country could contain this internal threat before it spread any further. As federal investigators analyzed the growing wave of violence, attention turned toward what lay beneath the surface. Intelligence, shared between the Department of Homeland Security and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, revealed that the unrest was not purely domestic. It was driven by a hybrid network combining extremist ideology with organized criminal activity. Analysts found digital evidence showing that small extremist cells and transnational gangs were collaborating through encrypted channels. These findings marked a shift in how law enforcement understood the threat. What had once been viewed as scattered anger was now identified as a coordinated campaign operating across multiple states. The methods used by these groups were complex and designed to avoid detection. Encrypted messaging applications, virtual private networks, and temporary safe houses were among their primary tools. Investigators discovered that several attacks shared identical patterns of communication and timing. The same online handles and digital footprints appeared in separate cases, including incidents in Dallas, Prairieland, and Broadview. Through data tracing and cross-state coordination, federal intelligence units were able to connect these dots, revealing the outline of a structure that functioned like a command chain without a visible headquarters. Within DHS, analysts created a new classification framework to better track and respond to this evolving landscape. The first category, domestic violent extremists, included small but highly organized cells motivated by political or anti-government ideology. They relied on discipline, coded communication, and rapid mobility, often using convoys of vehicles to overwhelm checkpoints. The second category, known as opportunistic agitators, referred to individuals embedded in lawful protests who acted as triggers when violence began. They were not fully committed extremists, but were susceptible to viral misinformation and could be activated by online disinformation campaigns. The third category, hybrid criminal networks, represented the most serious threat. These groups mixed ideology with profit motives and maintained known links to international cartels such as CJNG, Tren de Aragua, and the Sinaloa cartel. Their involvement explained the professional coordination, access to weapons, and the use of cross-border logistics seen in recent attacks. For federal intelligence teams, identifying the overlap between these categories became the key to understanding the scale of the problem. In several operations, individuals originally thought to be political activists were later found to be facilitators for smuggling networks. Data recovered from seized phones showed instructions, coded messages, and financial transactions routed through cryptocurrency wallets. The movement of funds often followed cartel laundering patterns, confirming that these operations were being financed through the same channels used for narcotics trafficking. The presence of transnational criminal influence transformed what was once seen as domestic extremism into a national security concern with international reach. By late summer, DHS fusion centers in Chicago, Dallas, and Portland were fully integrated into a shared intelligence network. This cooperation allowed agencies to track pre-operational activity in real-time. Analysts monitored suspicious purchases of tactical gear, travel records of known associates, and sudden spikes in encrypted communication. Predictive software helped identify likely flashpoints before they erupted. As a result, federal agents were able to intercept several planned attacks, preventing potential casualties. This intelligence coordination was one of the first large-scale domestic applications of counterterrorism strategies originally developed for overseas conflict zones. The discoveries from this network mapping led to the launch of Operation Midway Blitz, a multi-agency crackdown targeting individuals linked to the Broadview and Dallas incidents. Over 300 suspects were detained, and large caches of weapons, encrypted devices, and false identity documents were seized. While many of those arrested claimed to be part of activist movements, forensic analysis of their communications proved they were acting on coordinated instructions. The success of this operation confirmed that the violence was not spontaneous, but part of a deliberate attempt to destabilize enforcement institutions. The aftermath of the Broadview deployment quickly moved from the streets to the political arena. Within hours of the DHS armored units withdrawing from the area, the debate over federal authority and the limits of force erupted across Illinois. Governor J.B. Pritzker condemned the response, arguing that federal agents had used unnecessary aggression against demonstrators. The mayor of Chicago echoed this criticism, calling for an immediate review of the DHS operation. Their statements resonated among advocacy groups that viewed the Broadview incident as a symbol of growing federal intrusion into state matters. To them, the sight of armored vehicles on suburban streets represented an overreach of power that threatened civil liberties. Federal officials responded firmly, stating that the operation had been justified by the level of violence on site. They emphasized that local police had refused to assist and that DHS officers had faced coordinated attacks with incendiary devices and improvised weapons. In their view, the use of tactical vehicles and riot control equipment was a last resort to prevent further casualties. The confrontation between state leadership and federal agencies quickly evolved into a test of political influence. While Illinois officials sought to assert state oversight, Washington prioritized restoring authority after weeks of escalating violence against federal personnel. The conflict reached the judiciary when U.S. District Judge Sarah Ellis issued an emergency order requiring all ICE and Border Patrol officers operating in Illinois to wear body cameras. The decision came after viral footage showed the use of tear gas and crowd control rounds during the Broadview unrest. The court ruled that increased transparency was essential to maintain public trust. However, the order was met with immediate concern from DHS officials, who warned that it was impractical under current operational and financial constraints. Many agents had not yet been issued cameras, and federal budget freezes had delayed procurement for months. The new requirement placed officers in a difficult position. They were expected to engage in high-risk operations while ensuring compliance with recording protocols that did not yet exist. Inside DHS, the order triggered widespread frustration. Field commanders argued that their personnel were being scrutinized for actions taken under extreme pressure. Morale within ICE units dropped sharply. Agents expressed fear that every decision in the field could later be used as evidence in court. Internal reports showed a rise in stress-related absences and early retirement requests among frontline officers. Supervisors faced the challenge of maintaining readiness while navigating new legal and procedural oversight. For many within the agency, the Broadview incident had shifted the focus of their mission from enforcement to accountability. Public opinion reflected the same divide seen in government. In major cities, protests erupted, demanding tighter control over federal agencies. In more conservative regions, rallies were held in support of the officers, portraying them as defenders of law and order. The issue became a talking point in national media, with commentators framing it as part of a broader struggle between state autonomy and federal responsibility. Polling conducted in late September showed Illinois residents evenly split on whether the DHS response had been justified. The debate no longer centered only on Broadview, but on the role of federal power during domestic crises. Within Congress, discussions intensified over how to regulate federal operations during civil unrest. lawmakers debated whether additional legislation was needed to balance public transparency with officer safety. Some proposed new funding for body camera programs and better data sharing between federal and local agencies. Others called for stricter limits on when armored vehicles could be deployed on U.S. soil. While no consensus emerged, the hearings highlighted the growing recognition that the United States faced a new kind of internal security challenge, one that blurred the line between civil protest and organized violence. By October, Illinois had become the focal point of a national debate over the limits of federal enforcement. The Broadview riot, once a single violent night, had transformed into a legal and political confrontation that tested the balance of power between state and federal institutions. It exposed deep divisions over how the United States should handle domestic unrest and the degree to which force could be used to preserve order. As hearings continued and investigations expanded, the question facing the country was no longer about one operation in Illinois, but about the future framework of American internal security. In the weeks following the Broadview incident, the Department of Homeland Security underwent a major shift in its operational strategy. What began as a series of emergency responses evolved into a broader plan centered on prevention. Federal analysts concluded that the previous approach, which relied heavily on reacting to unrest after it began, left the country exposed to repeated cycles of violence. The new objective was to identify threats before they could take shape. This required integrating intelligence gathering, data sharing, and predictive modeling on a scale never before attempted within the United States. The cornerstone of this new approach was the creation of a national classification system known as Tier 2 Domestic Repression Threat Clusters. This framework was designed to categorize domestic groups capable of coordinating multi-state disruptions without direct foreign support. Each cluster was analyzed for its level of organization, funding, and communication capability. The system enabled intelligence agencies to move from case-by-case investigations to a nationwide assessment of risk. It also allowed policymakers to recognize patterns linking local events to broader national trends. For the first time, law enforcement could trace connections between small protest groups and larger extremist networks operating in multiple regions. The DHS fusion centers played a central role in this transformation. Facilities in Chicago, Dallas, and Portland were connected directly with the FBI Counterterrorism Division and the National Counterterrorism Center. These hubs processed data from federal, state, and local sources, including social media monitoring, financial transactions, and cross-border intelligence. The integration of these systems allowed for real-time threat detection. When unusual activity appeared in one region, alerts could be sent across the network instantly. This meant that patterns of potential coordination could be flagged before protests turned violent. The system also helped eliminate information silos that had previously slowed federal response times. While this approach strengthened the nation's ability to anticipate violence, it also raised questions about civil liberties and privacy. Critics warned that constant monitoring and data fusion could expand federal oversight into areas traditionally reserved for local jurisdictions. Supporters argued that the system was essential in an age where extremist coordination no longer required physical meetings. The debate reflected a broader tension between security and freedom that had long defined American governance. Nevertheless, the new model continued to expand as results became evident. Early reports indicated a reduction in coordinated attacks by nearly 20% within the first quarter of implementation. By the end of the year, DHS considered the program a foundation for the future of domestic security strategy. The Tier 2 classification and fusion network demonstrated that preventing conflict required not only force, but also foresight. The Broadview crisis had revealed the cost of waiting too long to act. The new doctrine sought to ensure that such a moment would never happen again. It marked the beginning of a more proactive and data-driven era in American homeland defense, one in which information itself became the most powerful tool of prevention. The events at Broadview have become more than a single night of unrest. They mark a turning point in how the United States defines its own security and the limits of federal power. What began as a local riot exposed a deeper struggle between law enforcement and ideology, between the authority of the state and the beliefs of its citizens. The aftermath forced the government to reconsider not only how it responds to violence, but how it prevents it from taking root in the first place. As tensions remain high, many wonder whether similar outbreaks could occur again in states that maintain strong sanctuary policies. Each protest now carries the potential to shift rapidly from civic expression to organized confrontation. The question facing America is how to balance protection and liberty in an era when threats can emerge from within. Intelligence units continue to monitor encrypted channels, tracing every sign of renewed coordination. If those signals return, the next flashpoint may rise without warning. The lessons of Broadview will shape how the nation prepares for what lies ahead. It is a reminder that the true battle for stability may no longer be fought abroad, but at home. The story of Broadview reminds us that America's greatest tests often begin within its own borders. How the nation responds will shape its future security. Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Military Power to stay informed about the next turning point in America's fight to protect its homeland.